Welcome into episode 267 of the Skate Podcast. I'm Brian DeFelice, joined by Scott McLaughlin. Scott, every time we do one of these without Bridget, my initial reaction instinct is to say joined by Bridget Prue and Scott McLaughlin because it's just so repetitive. But there's no Bridget today. She's broadcasting. She has broadcasting duties for college hockey this weekend.
Yeah, she's here in spirit. But yeah, Bridget's in the middle of like her busiest stretch of the year. I think she had 3 Providence games this weekend between Providence college games between men and women's. And then she has the women's Beanpot final, the first one ever at TD Garden on Tuesday. So we probably won't have her for our next episode as well. So all the Bridget fans who tune in only for Bridget, we're very sorry.
Yeah, and then she also has the PWHL obligations too that will be picking up as well. But yeah, I was gonna do one of those lights that she has behind her just to in memory of her, but she'll be back as soon as she can, probably midweek. So last night, Scott, the Bruins defeated the Canadiens 9-4 at the Garden, what one would call a rout of sorts, despite being a 1-goal game for the majority of it, or back and forth at least. Let's get right into the opening shifts because it's appropriate on a day after they score 9 goals for what you're about to talk about here.
Yeah, the Bruins are suddenly an offensive juggernaut. Since Christmas, they're the highest scoring team in the NHL, and that was true when they got to 5 goals last night. So the next 4 were all gravy. But yeah, obviously, like 9 goals, you never expect that. But even Jim Montgomery said after the game, he kind of felt like this had been building because they had a lot of good offensive habits. They've been getting more offensive zone time, generating more chances, having more bodies at the net, more guys taking the puck to the net. And yeah, they've only been held under 3 goals once in their last 13 games. They've scored 5 or more in 6 of those games. So they're, I know we're going to get into like the balance of the lineup and individuals who stood out, but they've got a top line that's rolling with Marchand, Coyle, Pasternak, which I know you're going to get into more. They've got depth. Danton Heinen starts that game as the 4th line right wing and ends up with his first career hat trick. Defensemen getting more involved. And, it's impressive to see because I don't think any of us really thought, they were going to be the best offensive team in the league for any stretch of games. And it's now going on almost a full month that they've outscored everyone else.
Yeah, just a quick glance at the standings in the goals for column. I think they're tied for 5th in goals for throughout the league with Toronto. Because it's a quick glance, I could have missed somebody on the bottom of the standings, but generally the further down you are, that you're not scoring more goals in the top of the league. But yeah, the balanced scoring is something that we'll get into as well. And you mentioned the top line, and that's my opening shift, which is Coyle, Pasternak, and Marchand. And Pasternak's been on fire all year, no matter who he's playing with. Coyle's been steady. Marchand's been steady, obviously for both of their standards. Coyle elevating his game offensively this year, but since the 3 of them have been together, they've been lights out as a line. The last handful of games, all 3 of those guys. Again, Pasternak always is scoring, but they're clicking, and there just seems. I know we've talked about maybe splitting up Marchand and Pasternak for balance, but to your point, the offensively they have been a juggernaut in the last month, and balance doesn't seem to be an issue with those guys on the same line. So it's weird, Scott. I feel like every other week this year with this Bruins team, it's like we'll talk about what their deficiencies are on paper and can it hold up in the postseason. And then every step of the way, aside from that, 3-week stretch in December where they were kind of up and down, like I don't know, they're just spitting in our face, and they're just like. And again, I'm glad, but I mean, Charlie Coyle's playing like he's on pace for probably high 60s in points this year. Is that an elite number 1 center? No. But when you're when you're a cog in a wheel of a machine that just keeps rolling, I don't know. in all sincerity, I can't sit here and point out flaws of this team when they're playing this well. And their top line with Marchand and Pastrnak back together, Coyle has been a better fixture between them than Zacha was at times. And if the rest of the roster is going to pull their weight like this, I I'm kind of speechless. Like let's see what happens with this team.
Yeah, like I think we all kind of felt like, the reasoning behind splitting up Marchand and Pastrnak is you might not really have a real second line if you don't do that. If you load them up, are you going to get enough from another line? And right now they are with that second line of Van Riemsdyk, Zacha, and DeBrusk. And Jake DeBrusk has just completely turned his season around and has been a point per game player for the last month. 13 points in his last 13 games. Just a force offensively. You'd see him score a great goal, taking the puck right to the front out of the corner and jamming it past Montembeault. Puck protection, wheeling around the net to set up Zacha for a goal. Zacha, you wonder how he does away from Pastrnak. I think the points haven't been there as much recently, but I think he's been playing pretty well, and it was nice to see him get that goal because I think he's had a couple chances recently that haven't gone in. Thinking of like a couple one-timers or snappers from the high slot in particular. Van Riemsdyk keeps playing well, especially when it comes to playmaking. He continues to just rack up assists. He almost scored a great goal on the power play, dragging the puck through his legs, shooting through his legs. He, the moves he has in tight spaces down low are the way he consistently is able to get to his forehand and get shots off is pretty impressive. And then the bottom six, like Montgomery's clearly kind of changed how he approaches that group where, he maybe isn't looking for a fourth line with a particular identity or toughness or whatever. Now he's kind of just looking for more balance there. And you look at what he rolled out for Saturday night, he keeps Lauko on the third line with Geeky and Frederick. Poitras comes back into the lineup, and he's on, again, like a quote-unquote fourth line with Boquist and Heinen. Poitras ended up being one of only two skaters who didn't have a point. 16 out of 18 Bruins skaters had a point in that game. But I thought Poitras played pretty well, especially, first game back from injury. He was involved in a couple chances. He was the one driving the net on Heinen's 2-on-1. Heinen made the right call, obviously sticking with the shot and finishing, but Poitras was right there and a part of that. So, suddenly it just looks like a really balanced lineup where early in the season, if you load up Marchand and Pastrnak, I think you sit there and say, wow, it's a really top-heavy lineup. Where's the rest of the offense coming from?
Yeah, and you mentioned that fourth line, and yeah, I mean, Danton Heinen gets his first hat trick as an NHL pro, over 400 games, and he does so in a fourth line role. I mean, obviously, his hat trick goal came in the power play, and that was probably a bit of a way to try to get him that hat trick. But yeah, it's a line that you mentioned, Poitras, Heinen, and Boquist, which ironically last episode I had mentioned, like I would kind of like to see that because I was looking at based on the roster and the way that the lines were constructed as of late, I just saw an opportunity to see what that line could be as a fourth line. Again, like I love the idea historically of a big, strong fourth line that can be well defensively, but can also impose their will physically on opponents, especially in a 7-game playoff series. But those days are quickly kind of they're starting to vanish, and I think that the Bruins nowadays can check with their feet, as well as checking with the body, just because it might not be the game you love to watch all the time, but it's the reality. The game's changing a bit, and like Boquist and Heinen and Poitras can certainly, that's a fast line. It's a really fast line. You want to call them a fourth line or whatever. that's a fast hockey line. And I think again, this Bruins team, I'm not concerned with labels. Like, obviously, Pastrnak, Coyle, and Marchand is a first line. But beyond that, it's like whoever's playing is playing. Taking away Pastrnak from Zacha was something that I was starting to wonder why the Bruins were so reluctant to do so. We all love the idea of them playing together because they're countrymen and they played so well with Krejci last year. But they had kind of plateaued at times this year, and why everybody, including us, were so reluctant to even consider splitting them up, I don't really know. But now that they have been split up, to your point, Zacha's playing really well with Van Riemsdyk and Jake DeBrusk, and I don't think it's a coincidence that in the last month, when Jake DeBrusk is a point per game guy, not that he has to be over the course of a whole season, but Jake DeBrusk starts scoring the way he can score, and now we're talking about a team that has the highest offense in the last month. It's not a coincidence. You need players on this team not named David Pastrnak to carry their weight offensively, if not elevate their game. And you're starting to see that now. It's what makes a difference between a team that's going to have a superstar burnout and having a team that's a well-oiled machine. And it's not just that we're happy for Jake DeBrusk for scoring. Personally, they need him. And that's why I was so frustrated with him earlier in the year, up until a month ago, because I'm glad that he was playing well for the analytic darlings out there, but the team needed him to score. And we all knew that. We all knew that. But now that he is, it's vital to this team's success. And there's only so many guys on the Bruins roster that are capable of doing that. He's one of them. Now he's doing it. And here we go.
Yeah, he's playing like a second liner, and now your second line looks like a second line. Like that, exactly. Yeah, I think the concern with taking Zacha away from Pastrnak was just what is Zacha away from Pastrnak? Just because we haven't seen it a whole lot in Boston. Like he's just been with them so much that you're like, okay, yeah, he had a career year last year. He's producing at a decent rate this year, but so much of it is with Pastrnak. So if you take him away, does that go down? Do you worried? Do you maybe start to see New Jersey level production from Zacha, which isn't really top 6 production? And we'll see. It's going to take a little longer before we know that answer for sure. I would just say, like, I think he's playing like a top 6 forward still, even though the points have been a little down. And I think some of those same concerns are there for DeBrusk, because when he really started going, it was when he was on a line with Coyle and Marchand, and then you move those two up with Pastrnak, and you wonder, okay, does DeBrusk kind of get left behind, or can he keep it going? And to his credit, he's just kept playing the same way, if not gotten even better since leaving those two. So that's what you need to see, is you need to see guys not have to be carried by one of Pastrnak or Marchand on their line. And right now, DeBrusk is certainly producing away from them. I think Van Riemsdyk's produced somewhat consistently, no matter where he's been. He's made things happen, so he's up there on the second line now. And Zacha for now a good fit there. And I think if some more points start to come for him, then it's really going to look good, and you're going to have very few questions about that second line.
Yeah, and also another combination that the Bruins might try at some point. I know I just talked about how I like the Boquist, Poitras, Heinen look, but I was actually on YouTube recently, and I was looking at Boquist in New Jersey, and there was a video of his like 2021, 22 highlights or something like that. And virtually every goal and assist that he was a part of, who else was a part of that play? Was Pavel Zacha. And I think it's flying under the radar a little bit that those two played together in New Jersey and played pretty well. I think both those players were underwhelming if you ask New Jersey fans, but there's a history there of them playing together and producing at the NHL level. And prior to this iteration of Bruins forward lines playing so well, they're playing so well right now, you don't want to really touch anything. But the thought did cross my mind of like maybe they try Boquist, Zacha, and Pastrnak at some point.
That they actually did try in training camp and maybe even a preseason game or two. But he definitely took some shifts there and then didn't quite stick, and obviously didn't even make the team out of camp. But
right.
They did have that in mind at one point, or at least wanted to see it.
Yeah, and he's a different player right now than he was in training camp. There's probably a lot going on there, a new system, nerves. I don't know, but he seems to be, you know, he has surpassed Johnny Beecher on the depth chart, and that Beecher. We'll get to Beecher and Lohrei. They got sent down to Providence. So yeah, but overall, this Bruins team offensively, they're a top 5 team in the NHL, and the last month, as you mentioned, they're the top offensive team in the NHL. And if you want to ask yourself why, how is that possible when they have Charlie Coyle and Pavel Zacha as your number 1 and number 2 centers, when they could probably ideally be a 2 and 3 on a championship team? Well, first of all, don't tell them that, because they're just going to keep trying to prove us all wrong, and that hockey is the ultimate team sport. But look up and down the lineup, the Bruins. I looked this up quickly before we started recording. I believe there's only one team in the NHL with more 20-point scorers so far this season, and it's Vancouver with 11. But the Bruins have 9 players on their roster right now with at least 20 points in the season. And that's more than teams like Colorado, Toronto, Florida. Now, sure, Colorado's top 3 or 4 players might have more than 50 points. But if we're illustrating depth for 20 plus points, at least, the Bruins, I think, are second in the NHL with 9 20-point scores at the midway point here. And, certain names that might surprise you could be Morgan Geekie with 22 points. Trent Frederick, 24 points. But I think we all kind of expected Frederick to still be a good player this year. And then just be, so David Pastrnak, Marchand, Coyle, McAvoy, Van Riemsdyk, Zacha, Frederick, DeBrusk, Geekie, all 20 points or more. Heinen, 17, Lindholm, 16, Poitras, 15, and so on. But it's just, if you want to know how, simply put, you have a lot of guys contributing.
Yeah, and during this most recent stretch, like, I just pulled up point totals over the last 13 games, and it's like those are all the guys leading it. I mean, obviously Pasternak's just been ridiculous all season. He has 22 points in these last 13 games, 4 straight multi-point games. And stat that I looked up last night that's just crazy is he now has multiple points in more than half of the Bruins games this season, 23 out of 45. Just silly stuff. He's up to 66 points, 30 goals already. So third in the NHL in both of those. He's on pace for 120 points. He had 113 last year, and that was something we hadn't seen from a Bruin since Adam Oates in the 90s. But by the way, Saturday night was the New Blood, New Beginnings era, which covered. I don't know if that's the official name. I don't know that anyone's really calling it that, but 1986 to 2000. So celebrating those Bork Neely teams. That they highlighted the 88 team that ended the Montreal jinx. The Bruins had gone, I think it was 45 years without beating the Canadiens in the playoffs, something like that. So that's pretty cool. Once again, they just continue to do a really good job with these eras nights. But yeah, then after Pastrnak, like, Marchand has 15 points in 13 games. Coyle 15. DeBrusk, I mentioned, a point per game. Charlie McAvoy, remember how we were talking about he's playing okay, but not really Norris caliber level? Well, he's got 12 points in the last 13 games, and he's a plus 16. Like, that's pretty crazy. Frederick, 10 points. Geekie, 10 points. Hampus Lindholm has 9 in the last 13 games now, after, obviously a very quiet start offensively to the season for him. So you're seeing some defensemen get more involved too. Grizzlick had a nice assist on Saturday. He has 6 points in the last 11 games. So it's just, it all just seems to be clicking right now of just everyone getting involved and chipping in and doing their part. And, and they've done it without being completely healthy during this stretch. Like, Poch has missed time. Carlos missed time. Forbort obviously just returned after, not that he's, contributing a ton offensively, but he returns for the first time in, a month and a half.
Look, I mean, 68 points between Van Riemsdyk, Geekie, and Danton Heinen halfway through the season. I mean, I'm wearing a winter hat right now, so Scott, maybe you can do a little tip of the cap to Don Sweeney. But that is some serious bargain. That's some serious bargain shopping in the offseason. And I think right now is an appropriate time to talk about Danton Heinen. He gets his first hat trick as an NHLer. We all know his story this year. Just kind of his second stint with the Bruins, sandwiched around brief stints in Anaheim and Pittsburgh for a little bit. But he comes to Boston on a PTO this offseason. Dan Heinen is an NHL. He's a straight up middle six NHL player. Middle six, fourth liner. He's a Swiss Army knife. He's an NHL player. The fact that he did not have a contract going into the training camp or even the regular season for that matter is very, very peculiar, and the Bruins capitalized. But for him to stick with it and know that he is that kind of player, doesn't have a contract at the drop of the regular season puck, despite having a good training camp. And look, he gets a hat trick last night. He's got 17 points in 37 games. Scott, what do you think of Heinen's story? And I don't think there's going to be a Disney movie about him, but it's an inspirational story about sticking with it and believing in yourself.
Yeah, it is crazy that he didn't have a single contract offer during the offseason. He's still, he's late 20s, 27, maybe 28 now. And 2 years ago in Pittsburgh, scored I think 18 goals. It's wild. He had a little bit of a down year last year, but he was playing down in the lineup in Pittsburgh, and just didn't put up as many goals as the year before. But to your point, he's just such a steady two-way player. Consistently makes smart plays. He can make things happen with the puck and a stick. He wins battles. He's smart defensively. You would think. I keep thinking back. Someone tweeted this. I mean, I apologize for not remembering who it is, but they're every team's looking for a Danton Heinen, but they don't realize it's actually Danton Heinen. Everyone wants that kind of Swiss Army knife player who can move up and down the lineup, play either wing, smart 200-foot player. But then you see Danton Heinen's name, and it's just not sexy enough. And for some teams decide they try to look everywhere else for it. But yeah, credit to him for, obviously taking advantage of the opportunity. Coming in on PTO, there's absolutely nothing guaranteed. And, I'm sure Jim Montgomery, as his former college coach, wanted him to win a job. He wanted to see him do well in training camp and preseason. Excuse me. But he wasn't going to give him a job if he didn't earn it. He can like him personally as much as possible. But Heinen had to go out and earn that, and he did. And we all saw it. We were saying by halfway through the preseason schedule that, hey, it looks like Danton Heinen should probably make this team. And he just never really let up. And obviously then had to deal with the delayed start to the regular season where he doesn't get a contract right away for whatever reasons, for cap reasons, because the Bruins wanted to figure other things out on the roster. And he did get off to, a little bit of a slow start once he finally got going, which again had to be expected because everyone else was 9 games into the season and he's starting at game 1. But yeah, he's been incredibly valuable. The fact that he's at any line he's been on, he's fit in. And when you drop him down to that fourth line, it's such a clear upgrade in terms of what that line can do offensively, because we've talked about it plenty. When it was Lauko, Beecher, Steen for a long stretch of time, it was you'd like some of the things those guys were doing, but they just weren't scoring. And at some point, a fourth line does have to contribute offensively.
Yeah, and they weren't scoring, and they also weren't great defensively either, right? So, I mean, all those guys had minuses on the season, significant minuses for the most part. And yeah, I mean, Boquist, Heinen, in particular, those two. If you want to put Potter with them or somebody else, that's fine. But that's going to be a responsible NHL, line with speed. And when the Bruins traded away Danton Heinen for Nick Ritchie, at the time, I honestly I was hand up kind of in the good riddance type camp, because I remember, and we started this podcast shortly after the Bruins got rid of Heinen. I think it was maybe maybe the following season. But when the Bruins lost to St. Louis, they lost to St. Louis in part because they lost the physical battle of attrition over 7 games. I felt as though St. Louis, they imposed their will more on the forecheck, and I thought they won a lot more battles around the ice. And I thought Danton Heinen, along with others, were one of the Bruins that lost those battles. I remember watching Game 7 against St. Louis, and it's well documented. Everybody will sit there and say, "Oh, the Bruins blitzed them. Binnington stood on his head. He's the reason that they won." Not really. The Bruins outshot St. Louis for like the first 12 minutes of the game, fine, and then St. Louis took over. And I remember watching that game, and the Bruins were so sticking to their system. They were waiting for St. Louis to make a mistake on forechecks as opposed to going in and taking things from them. And for some reason, Heinen stuck out in my head as one of those forwards who just was too busy worrying about where he was supposed to be from the X's and O's perspective, as opposed to just making shit happen. And I don't think I was wrong at that time with that assessment. I think he was one of many Bruins that they lost a physical battle, and they weren't a soft team by any means that year, but they weren't tougher than the team that won the cup. And I guess it's a long-winded way of me saying I don't think I was wrong back then, but I also think that Danton Heinen is a different player now. And he seems to me like he's just more mature, and he is more physical, not so much in like a I'm going to run you over type of way, but he goes to tougher areas, and he just seems like a stronger player on the puck, and he plays on the inside more. And that's a credit to him.
Yeah, and I remember early, I don't remember if it was preseason or maybe early in the regular season, possibly like right after he signed the contract. He was asked like, how do you think your game's changed since the last time you were there? And that was the very first thing he said was, I think I've gotten a lot better at winning battles. And he talked about learning how to use his body, learning how to take better angles, get position on guys, get leverage, and use a stick to take the puck away. So he's clearly focused on that since the last time he was here. And you're right, you do see the improvement. And I think back to, it was probably a few weeks ago at this point, but Montgomery every now and then will drop in some of their internal stats that they track. And at the time, he had said like Heinen was one of their top guys in terms of winning one-on-one battles. I'm going to assume, a few weeks later, that's still true, because certainly to the eye test, I haven't seen anything that would suggest that's gone downhill. But yeah, it's, what, like, you're making a good point though about being physical without necessarily having to throw a ton of hits. Because ultimately, if you win a one-on-one battle with leverage, body position, good stick work, it accomplishes the same thing as winning it by just straight up knocking the guy off the puck with a hit. Like, yeah, it's sexier to do it with the hit. And in a playoff series, there is value to that because you can physically wear teams down. Not that you want to sit here and say like you're trying to injure guys, but you potentially beat some guys up and cause some injuries or some bumps and bruises that, can cause someone's play to decline the rest of the series. So there is value to it in the playoffs. And I think we're going to be talking about whether or not this Bruins team can do that in the playoffs. That's going to be a fair conversation to have. But in the meantime, though, you can do it other ways. You don't always have to be the most physical team. Obviously, Bruins fans are scarred by that Blues series, and it leads to a lot of thinking that you have to be the more physical team to win. But there's also been teams that have won without being the most physical. I don't think Vegas was the most physical team in the playoffs last year. I don't think they're the most physical team in the Stanley Cup Finals. I think Florida was, but Vegas won. I don't think Colorado was the most physical team the year they won the Cup. So there are other ways to do it. It is actually possible. You don't just have to hit your way to a championship.
Well, but there's an important distinction there, because I agree with you. there is a difference between there's a fine line, right? There's a bit of a difference between the teams that win the championship and the teams that beat the Bruins.
Sure, yeah.
Like it does seem like St. Louis out physical the Bruins, the Islanders out physical the Bruins, the Panthers out physical the Bruins, Carolina, 50-50, but a big team. So you're right. You don't have to hit your way to a championship, but there does seem to be a pattern that kind of gives the Bruins trouble there's a commonality between teams that eliminate the Bruins from the playoffs. At least that's what it appears to me from the outside looking in.
Yeah, and I also think that's where, Montgomery's made it such a focus to win net front battles and win battles down low. I think the Bruins will look at it and say, yes, they got out hit by Florida last year, but, you're probably not completely changing that in one off season. Florida's still going to be a really physical team, but can you win more battles at your own net front against their guys? Can you get more pucks and bodies to their net front? And that's something that the Bruins, for the most part, have been doing this season. They have been pretty good at both net fronts, and especially this recent stretch, like they're getting a lot of goals by going to those areas and winning those battles and scoring kind of greasy goals. I mean, how many of those 9 goals last night were scored like almost right at the net front? It's DeBrusk right across the crease to Zacha, Coyle right in front to Marchand, Heinen tipping in a shot from Grizzly with 2 bodies at the front. I think it was Geeky was also at the net front there. Like, yeah, those are the kind of goals you have to score in the playoffs. And I do think they're doing the work to score more of those this year than last year when they scored more goals in general, but so many of them were they're just straight up more skilled and more talented than the team they're facing, and they can almost score, however they want.
Yeah, and that's what was so infuriating last spring was it wasn't just that the Bruins had more skill than the Panthers and most other teams. They also had the personnel to be a very physical team as well. Like, it blew my mind how much the Bruins were out physical last year. When you have a team that has Garnet Hathaway and Tyler Bertuzzi and Trent Frederick and Nick Foligno and Charlie McAvoy and just
Dmitry Orlov,
AJ Greer, who actually I don't think played a game. The Bruins weren't a pushover last year physically. I just think, like, personnel-wise, the Bruins, they had a tough team on paper. They had a skilled team on paper. I think what happened was, yes, there were injuries, but they also were up 3-1 with Bergeron and Krejci out. I think what happened was the Bruins they weren't tested enough game in and game out last year in the regular season. They weren't playing meaningful games for real. The only meaningful games they had was like, can we break a record? And I think this year they have to. They're not on pace to surpass their point total from last year, but the Bruins are still accumulating points at an NHL best, just about. But they're earning those points in a much more blue-collar fashion because they can't just rely on pure skill. So you might look at the standings between this year and last year, and the story might say, based on the standings and the points, well, the Bruins, they're not facing adversity this year either. But they are, because the points are being earned in such a different variety this year that it's different. They have to rely on a little bit more on meat and potatoes hockey, and that's better off for them in the long run. That's what happened with Florida last year. Florida was not the most talented team in the playoffs, certainly beyond Matthew Tkachuk and Sasha Barkov, but they found a way to play till June.
Yeah, and just to touch on the standings, Bruins are now 7 points clear of the rest of the Eastern Conference, 7 points ahead of both Florida and the Rangers. And it's funny, I feel like it was only, last week, maybe a week and a half ago, that Florida had pulled within a point or 2 points of them. And I said on here, I was like, Florida might pull ahead of them and kind of run away in the second half. Like they might just be a team that's rolling. I think they had won 9 in a row at that point. Now it's gone the other way. Like now it's the Bruins that have won 4 in a row. Florida slipped up a little bit here, and all of a sudden the Bruins have that gap again. And goal different. Obviously, 9-4 win helps, but goal differential, they're like pulling away from the pack. They're plus 38 now. Florida's next in the East at plus 22. Only Vancouver and Winnipeg are better in the whole NHL. And by the way, this should be a great game coming up Monday night. Bruins Jets at the Garden. Obviously, the Bruins got, they were in Winnipeg just before Christmas and got embarrassed there. So I think, we all agree they're playing a lot better now. So this will be a kind of an interesting measuring stick game for them on Monday.
Totally. Yeah, especially after you mentioned the first loss they had against them, but one of their worst games of the season. But when you mentioned that about Florida, Scott, at the time you said that, because I remember looking at the standings as you mentioned that, the Bruins were ahead of the Panthers in the standings by a point. They had the same games played, but the Bruins were ahead by a point. But Florida at that time had 3 more wins than the Bruins. And the only reason the Bruins were ahead by a point was because they accumulated so many overtime losses. But now, as you mentioned, the 4-game win streak by the Bruins, and Florida slipped a little bit. Now they have the same games played still, but the Bruins have one more win than Florida. So even though that they were still ahead of Florida the whole time, they were ahead of them with 3 less wins. Now they have 1 more win, and it just speaks to the direction that not so much Florida is going, but the way that the Bruins just keep getting better and better. And the Bruins win, Scott, they're coming in. They were winning earlier this year, but they weren't convincing. They were winning games that they were getting outshot in a lot, and games that I think territorially they were getting outplayed. But right now they're winning games on the scoreboard, and they're winning games, between the boards too.
Yeah. So I know we have to wrap up here in a few minutes, but want to make sure we talk about the defense. Brandon Carlo and Derek Forbort both returned to the lineup on Saturday. We found out Saturday morning, Carlo revealed that it was another concussion for him, which obviously is concerning. It's the 6th documented concussion of his career. He did say, this one wasn't as serious as some other ones. He wound up missing 5 games total. But he comes back in, scores a nice goal, actually, driving the net and finishing off a pass from Trent Frederick. Forbort back in after, a long time spent on LTIR. And the corresponding moves where Mason Lohrei gets sent to Providence and Johnny Beecher also gets sent to Providence. So even though the Bruins are now 1 short of a full 23-man roster, because Forbort makes $3 million and was on LTIR, they actually had to send 2 players down in order to activate him. So what was your reaction to those, those guys coming back, but also Beecher and Lohrei being the ones to get sent down?
Yeah, Beecher, I think, he's been – the 4th line has looked better with Boquist. And can you put Beecher on a wing? Sure. But I guess to answer your question, and sure, I have no issue with Beecher going down for now, because you have to continue to earn your spot, especially as a rookie. And don't forget, Boquist is a NHL caliber player. Started the year in Providence, obviously, but he has games under his belt at the NHL level, and he has point production under his belt at the NHL level. I would look it up right now, but I don't want to waste time. But I'm sure Boquist might have a 15, 20-point season under his belt at some point. Lohrei I did not like. I hate the idea of him going down to Providence. If it's just purely transactional and it's short term, whatever. But I think he's been a solid fixture and a very important player to the Bruins back end this year. He's very much been a part of their success. And what disappoints me most is that we all know that skill and offensive creativity is Lohrei's strengths, ironically, as a defenseman. But physically and defensively, he was improving with every game. And I don't like the idea of sending down a player while they're on an incline and improving. And to make room for Derek Forbort, I get it. I know, I understand. There's probably reasons contractually and cap wise why it just has to be done. But I also think it comes to the expense of Parker Wotherspoon, who we talked about last episode too. And I'm looking at two guys in Grzelcyk and Forbort, and two guys in Lohrei and Wotherspoon, and I'd rather the Wotherspoon and Lohrei in the lineup right now over Forbort and Grzelcyk. So that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, on Beecher, I think he was kind of the natural choice up front. He can go down without waivers. So even though I think maybe he might bring, actually I think he does bring more to the table than Oscar Steen. Steen would have had to clear waivers. My guess is he probably would have. I don't think he would have gotten claimed, but it's so close, and you might be talking about the 13th forward that you might as well play it safe and send down the guy who doesn't need waivers and who needs to play more. Like being a 13th forward up in Boston, I don't think would be all that valuable for Beecher. Like send him down to Providence, let him keep playing, let him work on really his all around game. I mean, you kind of said this earlier, and like I almost have to keep correcting myself. Like, yes, the offensive part of it, but there were things to be desired in his defensive game as well. Like you love the faceoffs. He's been their best or second best faceoff man all year. But that alone doesn't keep you in the lineup. So he has stuff he can work on. That's fine. Steen's 25. He's a little bit more at a point where he kind of is what he is. You don't necessarily need him playing every day for developmental purposes. On the blue line, I said this last episode, like no one deserved to come out of the lineup. No one deserved to get sent down. So it is kind of just a tough situation where, you can't keep Forbort on LTIR if he's healthy and cleared to play. A player might play the game with you for a little bit where it's like, hey, can you be patient? We're going to really play it safe. We have some things we have to work out. I think this happened a little bit with Taylor Hall last year. If you remember, like at one point there's that leak through Darren Dreger that Taylor Hall had been cleared but was still on LTIR. Like at some point you're going to run into NHLPA issues if you just try to stash a guy on LTIR, because no one wants to, like Derek Forbort doesn't want to sit there and be like, okay, I'm ready to play, but what, I have to stay on LTIR so Mason Lohrei can keep playing? Like, no thanks, I'm ready to play. So someone had to go, and I think Grzelcyk's been playing better, so he's going to stay in the lineup. He's on the roster. Maybe there's a trade coming at some point, but I don't think there's anything imminent there. So it had to be either Lohrei or Wotherspoon, and Lohrei can go back and forth without waivers. Wotherspoon, because he was technically an emergency recall this whole time, actually could have been sent back down, but then the next time he got called up, he would have needed waivers. So no matter what, you'd eventually run into a waiver situation with him. And the way he's playing, I think he deserves to be here. Like he's played really well. I think he's kind of an ideal 6'7" defenseman who can fit in anywhere, can play either side, defensively responsible. And, I guess similar to Beecher, like you do want Lohrei playing every game. You want him playing every night. That's ultimately what's going to be best. So if he was going to be in and out of the lineup or not playing every day, you probably have to send him down. But yeah, I'm with you though. Like he was playing better. I think he did going. So it's unfortunate.
Yeah, Scott, you kind of broke up there at the end, but yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying was that, yeah, it's unfortunate because everybody involved was playing well. I mean, do you think their best top six right now is personnel wise is Lindholm, McAvoy, Carlo Lohrei, Wotherspoon, and Shattenkirk? That's how injuries happen. It's not a big deal for half of the season. But I do think that's kind of it's not their most experienced, but so I don't want to discredit Grizzlick and Forbert's NHL tenures. That's disrespectful because they have proven to be solid NHL players. But right now, I kind of like that six defenseman personnel. But again, it's not the end of the world. It is what it is, and a lot of it's gamesmanship and semantics and hurdles you have to jump over as an NHL GM.
Yeah, it's so close that like I don't like. If I'm being honest, I think over the last maybe week and a half, 2 weeks, I do think Grizzlies probably played a little bit better of an all around game than Lohrei, but it's really close, and like it's a credit to both of them, honestly, because Grizzly had really been struggling the first half of the season, and I think has started to find his game again. I thought him and McAvoy. Now, look, it's a 9-4 game. It's Montreal. They're not a playoff team, but him and McAvoy were dominant when they were on the ice Saturday. They were a +3, and the Lindholm Carlo pairing was also a +3 as a pairing. It's tough. Like I do think Wotherspoon's probably playing. I'm gonna say he's playing better than Forbort right now. Like Forbort looks rusty, but it's also his first game in a month and a half. You're gonna give him a chance to shake off the rust and try to get going here. So Wotherspoon would probably be in for me, and then Lohrei versus Grizzly would be very close. And that's where like Lohrei loses out just because he's younger and he can go down without waivers, and that's unfortunate, but it's part of the business. And it's not the first time it's happened with him this year, and it's not the first time it's happened with a young player in general.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, barring any sort of trade that we don't know about, one way or another, these guys are all going to have their fingerprints on what happens to the Bruins this year, good, bad, or indifferent. Before we go, Scott, also worth mentioning Brad Marchand's 11th consecutive 20-goal season as a Bruin. Is that correct? And that's it's a team record.
Yep, it broke a 3-way tie. Bergeron and Johnny Busick also had 10 in a row, so he broke that tie. And of course, he gets asked about it after the game, and the first thing he says is, "It's too bad we had that lockout year, or it'd be my whole career," which is true. He would have hit 20 that year too. So yeah, a little unfortunate. He's got 13 total now, but 11 straight. So just an impressive feat. Just a nod to his consistency year after year. And obviously he's had quite a few seasons that have gone well above 20, and this will be another. He's got 20 through 45 games. But yeah, that's an impressive run.
Yeah, I mean, especially in a year like this for them, it's their centennial season, a season of honoring and celebrating the last 100 years of the franchise, and to do so in this year is really special. And another feather in his cap as an all-time Bruin. Obviously a top 100 player. I think he made the All Bruins team as well, right?
Yep.
So I mean, just between him and Pasternak, witnessing, we get to watch some of the greatest Bruins to ever do it. But okay, so Scott, you mentioned that they got the Jets on Monday. That's a great game. And I think that probably wraps it up, right?
Yeah, I think so. Only league note, this is just going to be fun to watch how this goes, is Patrick Waugh is the new head coach of the New York Islanders. Lou Lamoriello with classic, Big Lou mid-season bomb toss, just firing his coach and bringing in Patrick Waugh. So that's going to be fascinating. That's a team that obviously has really been struggling recently and quickly falling out of the playoff race, trying to save their season. And I guess, obviously hoping this does it, but
they gotta screw and bolt down those middle glass stanchions between benches down over there in Long Island. I'm sure Patrick Waugh will have a wonderful time and have no headaches at all trying to coach an offensively challenged Islanders team historically. But yeah,
I mean, this year defense has been their problem. That team has been awful defensively. Like if you look at the analytics, I don't know. I don't know if he can save them, but going to be fascinating to watch him try.
Absolutely.
And what the very last note from me, people watch Bridget on the Beanpot final call Tuesday night. Women's Beanpot, BU versus Northeastern. So go Terriers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a great couple weeks of hockey coming up. Scott has his Terriers playing the Eagles and some back-to-backs before the Beanpot, for the men's Beanpot. That'll be fun to watch. And yeah, January, February is a great time for hockey in the Massachusetts and New England area. So, yep, that wraps it up for Scott and I. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful work week, and we will talk to you guys on Wednesday. All right.